April 30, 1945. 1,647 hours. Outside the town of Moosburg, Bavaria. SS-Hauptsturmführer Friedrich Weber stood at a crossroads that would define the final chapter of the Third Reich's collapse. To his east, the Soviet Fifth Guards Army advanced with methodical fury. To his west, the American 14th Armored Division approached with a different reputation entirely. Weber commanded 847 men from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division. His radio crackled with desperate transmissions from units across southern Germany, all asking the same question: which direction should we run? The answer, documented in over 500,000 individual surrender records, would reveal one of World War II's most significant yet overlooked phenomena. German soldiers weren't just surrendering to Americans, they were fighting their way westward, through their own lines, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles, specifically to reach American forces before Soviet or other Allied armies could capture them. This wasn't cowardice. This was calculated survival based on information flowing through the Wehrmacht's collapsing command structure about something the Americans possessed that fundamentally differentiated their treatment of prisoners. What Weber and 500,000 German soldiers discovered would expose the hidden architecture of surrender, the invisible calculus of defeated armies, and the unexpected power of institutional systems over individual hatred in determining the fate of captured enemies. The mathematics of surrender had been carefully calculated in Berlin long before the first American soldier set foot on German soil. December 3, 1944. 0830 hours. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht Headquarters, Zossen, southeast of Berlin. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff, reviewed intelligence reports that would fundamentally alter German defensive strategy for the war's final months. The reports, compiled by Abwehr intelligence officers and Wehrmacht liaison units, contained detailed assessments of Allied prisoner-of-war treatment protocols. What emerged was a stark divergence that would cost the Third Reich its eastern territories while preserving a stubborn defense in the west. The Americans operated under the 1929 Geneva Convention with institutional precision that bordered on obsession. Their treatment of German POWs followed documented procedures that Jodl's staff had verified through multiple sources: Red Cross inspectors, repatriated wounded, and even intercepted American military correspondence. The American system, as documented in Wehrmacht intelligence files, functioned with industrial efficiency. Captured German soldiers received medical treatment within hours, regardless of rank or unit affiliation. Food rations, while not lavish, met or exceeded Geneva Convention requirements: 2,700 calories daily for working prisoners, 2,300 for non-working personnel. The Americans maintained detailed records of every prisoner, ensuring notification to families through the International Red Cross within weeks of capture. But the intelligence reports revealed something more significant than mere protocol compliance. The Americans had constructed an entire infrastructure for prisoner management that operated independently of battlefield emotions. The Provost Marshal General's office had established 155 prisoner-of-war camps across the continental United States by early 1945, each governed by regulations that local commanders could not arbitrarily override. German officers retained their rank privileges. Enlisted men worked for wages. Mail flowed regularly. Religious services continued without interference. Contrast this with reports flowing from the Eastern Front, documented in increasingly desperate communications from units facing Soviet forces. Wehrmacht intelligence had compiled testimony from the few German prisoners who escaped Soviet captivity and made their way back to German lines. The pattern was unambiguous and terrifying. Soviet treatment of German POWs existed outside any recognizable framework of international law. Oberst Heinrich Gerlach, who had been captured at Stalingrad and escaped during a prisoner transport in July 1944, provided testimony that circulated through Wehrmacht command structures. His report, classified as most secret but deliberately leaked to unit commanders, described a system of deliberate attrition. Forced marches covering hundreds of kilometers without adequate food or water. Medical treatment denied even for treatable wounds. Labor camps in the Urals where survival rates hovered below 30% for the first winter. Summary executions for prisoners deemed politically unreliable, a category that included virtually any officer above the rank of Hauptmann. The calculations were brutal and simple. Surrender to the Americans meant survival with dignity intact. Surrender to the Soviets meant probable death preceded by conditions that violated every conception of military honor. By January 1945, this knowledge had permeated every level of the Wehrmacht's command structure, from division commanders to individual squad leaders. March 15, 1945. 1,120 hours. Prisoner Processing Center, Remagen Bridgehead. The American 9th Armored Division had captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact 8 days earlier, and German prisoners were flooding into hastily established collection points at a rate that overwhelmed initial projections. Lieutenant Colonel James Hartwick, commanding the 45th Military Police Battalion, supervised a processing operation that would become the template for American POW handling through the war's final weeks. What distinguished American prisoner operations wasn't sentiment, it was systematization. The U.S. Army had spent 3 years developing prisoner-of-war protocols based on lessons learned in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. By the time American forces crossed the Rhine, these procedures had been refined to industrial precision. Every prisoner followed the same pathway, regardless of unit, rank, or battlefield conduct. The process began at forward collection points, typically within 1,000 yards of the front lines. German soldiers were searched for weapons and intelligence materials, then tagged with capture cards documenting name, rank, serial number, unit, and location of capture. Medical personnel screened for wounds requiring immediate treatment. Within hours, prisoners moved to division-level cages where processing intensified. At division cages, U.S. Army intelligence officers conducted detailed interrogations following strict protocols established by the Military Intelligence Service. These weren't brutal affairs, they were systematic information extractions following techniques developed by professional interrogators. The Americans had learned that well-treated prisoners provided better intelligence than those subjected to harsh treatment. Food, cigarettes, and medical attention preceded questioning. The approach yielded extraordinary results. The physical infrastructure supporting this system revealed American industrial capacity in microcosm. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers constructed semi-permanent POW facilities that included barracks, kitchens, medical dispensaries, and administrative offices. By March 1945, the Theater Provost Marshal's office operated 47 major prisoner enclosures in the European theater, each capable of housing 5,000 to 30,000 prisoners. The logistical tail supporting these facilities, food supplies, medical equipment, administrative personnel, represented a commitment of resources that astounded German prisoners accustomed to Wehrmacht's collapsing supply situation. But the true differentiator wasn't infrastructure, it was institutional commitment to established rules. The American Army operated under regulations that individual commanders could not arbitrarily suspend. The Articles of War, updated in 1920 and revised in 1944, specified precise treatment standards for enemy prisoners. Violations carried serious consequences, including courts-martial for officers who mistreated prisoners under their control. General Major Hans Kramer, captured on March 20 near Koblenz, testified in post-war interviews about his astonishment at American procedures. Within 24 hours of capture, he had received medical examination, 3 meals, and notification that the International Red Cross had been informed of his status. His personal effects, including his officer's dagger, were inventoried and stored. He was addressed by rank. The contrast with reports from the Eastern Front was absolute. The Americans weren't motivated by kindness, they were motivated by institutional procedure. The difference was profound. Institutional systems operated independently of individual hatred, fear, or revenge. A German soldier who had killed Americans hours earlier received the same processing as one who had surrendered without firing a shot. The system didn't care about battlefield conduct, it cared about procedural compliance. This institutional indifference to individual circumstances created an unexpected outcome: predictability. German soldiers facing capture could calculate with reasonable certainty what would happen under American custody. That predictability, documented in thousands of prisoner testimonies and Wehrmacht intelligence assessments, would drive the massive westward flight in the war's final weeks. February 28, 1945. 0445 hours. Outside Kustrin, 80 kilometers east of Berlin. Oberst Victor Steinmann commanded what remained of the 309th Infantry Division, approximately 4,200 men facing the full weight of Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front. The Soviet offensive had shattered German lines, and Steinmann faced a decision that commanders across the Eastern Front confronted with increasing frequency: fight to the death, or attempt the nearly impossible journey westward to American lines, still over 500 kilometers away. The calculation had been made easier by information flowing through Wehrmacht communication networks. Reports from units that had faced Soviet capture painted a picture so consistently grim that even National Socialist propaganda couldn't suppress the truth. The Red Army's treatment of German prisoners operated under entirely different principles than anything recognized by international convention. Soviet prisoner policy, as documented in Wehrmacht intelligence assessments compiled from escaped prisoners and intercepted communications, followed a logic of retribution rather than regulation. The Soviet Union had not signed the 1929 Geneva Convention regarding treatment of prisoners of war. Stalin's government considered the convention a bourgeois affectation irrelevant to the ideological struggle against fascism. More significantly, Soviet treatment of German POWs reflected the catastrophic German treatment of Soviet prisoners earlier in the war. Approximately 3.3 million Soviet POWs had died in German custody between 1941 and 1945. The mathematics of Soviet captivity were brutally simple. Wehrmacht intelligence estimated that fewer than 40% of German soldiers captured by Soviet forces would survive the first year of captivity. The causes were systematic: forced marches covering hundreds of kilometers immediately after capture, often in winter conditions without adequate clothing. Starvation rations, typically 400 to 600 calories daily, insufficient to sustain life during hard labor. Medical treatment denied for most conditions, leading to death from wounds or diseases easily treatable with basic care. Labor camps in the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia where prisoners worked in mines, lumber operations, and construction under conditions designed to extract maximum labor before death. Lieutenant Werner Hoffmann, who escaped from a Soviet prisoner column near Poznan in January 1945 and made his way back to German lines, provided testimony that Wehrmacht intelligence deliberately circulated to combat units. His account, validated by multiple similar reports, described conditions that violated every norm of military conduct. Prisoners were marched up to 40 kilometers daily without food. Those who collapsed were shot where they fell. No medical personnel accompanied the columns. Prisoners with visible wounds were separated and never seen again, presumed executed as requiring resources the Soviets wouldn't expend. But beyond physical treatment, Soviet captivity carried a different psychological weight. The Red Army made no distinction between Wehrmacht regulars and SS units, between those who had committed atrocities and those who had fought conventionally. Political officers accompanying Soviet forces conducted summary screenings, identifying officers, Nazi party members, and anyone deemed politically dangerous for immediate execution or transfer to NKVD custody, outcomes often indistinguishable from execution but delayed. The contrast with American treatment wasn't subtle, it was existential. German soldiers facing the Soviets understood they were choosing between possible death in combat and probable death in captivity. The Americans offered a third option: survival. This calculation, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of individual soldiers, would create the greatest mass military migration of the European war's final phase. Steinmann made his decision at 0630 hours on February 28. His division would fight a delaying action against Soviet forces while simultaneously executing a fighting withdrawal westward. The goal wasn't to hold ground, it was to buy time to reach American lines before Soviet encirclement made it impossible. Over the next 6 weeks, approximately 2,800 of his original 4,200 men would succeed in reaching American forces near the Elbe River. Their journey would epitomize the desperate westward flight that defined the Wehrmacht's final chapter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. April 12, 1945. 1,320 hours. Harz Mountains, Central Germany. General Lieutenant Theodor Bussy commanded army group positions that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. His Ninth Army, nominally consisting of 200,000 men, had fragmented into dozens of independent battle groups, each making individual decisions about survival. The question wasn't whether to surrender, it was to whom. Wehrmacht communication networks, though degraded, still functioned sufficiently to transmit intelligence that shaped these decisions. Reports indicated that American forces had halted their advance along the Elbe River, approximately 120 kilometers from Berlin. Soviet forces, meanwhile, were preparing for the final assault on the capital with over 2.5 million men. The gap between these armies represented the last corridor for westward escape. The phenomenon that military historians would later term the Great Westward Flight began in earnest during the second week of April 1945. German units across the Eastern Front initiated what appeared to be tactical retreats but were actually calculated migrations toward American lines. The scale was unprecedented, entire divisions, sometimes maintaining unit cohesion, sometimes dissolving into smaller groups, moved westward with singular purpose. Oberst Ernst Hartmann, commanding the 712th Infantry Division near Magdeburg, documented the decision-making process in orders that survived the war. His division, approximately 7,800 men, occupied defensive positions facing Soviet forces 30 kilometers to the east. American units had established positions 15 kilometers to the west. On April 14, Hartmann issued orders that explicitly prioritized westward movement over defensive operations. All units will conduct fighting withdrawal toward American sector. Maintain unit cohesion where possible. Primary objective is reaching American lines before Soviet encirclement. The movement required extraordinary coordination and determination. German units had to disengage from Soviet forces without triggering overwhelming pursuit, cross terrain increasingly devastated by years of warfare, and approach American positions without being destroyed by forces that had every reason to view advancing German formations as continued resistance. The logistics were nightmarish. Units carried wounded, preserved what equipment they could, and maintained enough combat capability to fight through obstacles while simultaneously signaling surrender intentions. The Americans, initially confused by German formations advancing toward their positions, quickly recognized the phenomenon. Intelligence officers from the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies documented systematic German efforts to reach American rather than Soviet custody. By mid-April, American commanders had established protocols for processing what became a flood of German surrenders, sometimes receiving entire battalions, intact with officers and equipment, explicitly requesting American rather than Soviet captivity. The human cost of this migration was substantial. German units attempting to break westward faced Soviet pursuit, American defensive fire from forces uncertain of German intentions, and the general chaos of a collapsing front. Wehrmacht records, incomplete due to command structure breakdown, suggest thousands died during the westward flight, not in conventional combat, but in the desperate effort to reach American lines. What made these losses acceptable to German commanders was the alternative. Intelligence reports, corroborated by multiple sources, indicated that Soviet forces were deliberately preventing German units from moving westward. Red Army commanders understood the preference German soldiers showed for American captivity and moved to block escape routes. The result was a race, German units trying to move west before Soviet forces could encircle them and American forces trying to process surrenders while maintaining defensive positions against remaining German resistance elsewhere. The phenomenon revealed something fundamental about military surrender. It wasn't simply about ending combat, but about calculating post-combat survival. German soldiers were making rational decisions based on available information about comparative treatment. The westward flight represented collective acknowledgement that the war was lost, but individual fates remained negotiable based on who captured them. April 18, 1945. 0940 hours. POW enclosure A7, near Attichy, France. Hauptmann Ludwig Reinhardt had surrendered to American forces 6 days earlier after his battle group, remnants of the 276th Volksgrenadier Division, completed a 200-kilometer fighting withdrawal to reach U.S. Ninth Army positions. What he experienced in American custody would validate the calculations that had driven his desperate westward journey. The American POW system operated with bureaucratic precision that seemed surreal against the chaos of collapsing Germany. Within hours of capture, Reinhardt had been photographed, fingerprinted, and issued a prisoner identification card. His personal effects were inventoried and stored, including his officer's sold watch, wristwatch, and family photographs. An American medical officer examined a shrapnel wound in his shoulder, cleaned it, administered sulfa drugs, and bandaged it properly for the first time in 3 weeks. The systematization extended beyond individual processing. The Americans had constructed an entire institutional architecture for prisoner management that operated independently of battlefield emotions or individual grievances. Reinhardt's enclosure, housing approximately 12,000 German prisoners, included organized barracks, mess facilities serving 3 meals daily, a medical dispensary staffed by both American and German doctors, and administrative offices processing paperwork with industrial efficiency. What struck Reinhardt most forcefully was the institutional nature of his treatment. The American guards weren't particularly friendly, many were young soldiers who had lost friends to German fire weeks earlier. But they operated within defined boundaries enforced by regulations they couldn't arbitrarily ignore. When prisoners complained about inadequate latrine facilities, American engineers expanded them within 48 hours, not from compassion but from procedural compliance with sanitation regulations. The food, while hardly luxurious, met standards specified in Geneva Convention protocols, approximately 2,700 calories daily for working prisoners. Reinhardt, as an officer, wasn't required to work, but German enlisted men who volunteered for labor received wages credited to accounts accessible after the war. Mail service operated through the International Red Cross. Reinhardt submitted a letter to his wife in Bavaria on April 20 that she received on May 15, confirmed by post-war testimony. Contrast this with reports filtering through the prisoner network from German soldiers who had been in Soviet custody and subsequently transferred to American control through various complicated routes. Their testimonies, shared in whispered conversations in the barracks, described an entirely different reality: starvation rations, forced labor without medical treatment, summary executions for trivial infractions, and complete absence of communication with families. The American system's greatest strength was its impersonality. Unlike Soviet treatment, which operated on principles of political retribution and individual hatred for fascist invaders, American treatment followed institutional protocols that didn't distinguish between ardent Nazis and reluctant conscripts, between those who had fought fanatically and those who surrendered immediately. The system processed everyone identically. This institutional indifference created an unexpected outcome: it was survivable. Reinhardt calculated that he would likely survive American captivity and eventually return to Germany. That calculation, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, validated the terrible westward flight that had cost thousands of lives but saved many more from the alternative fate in Soviet hands. The American guards enforcing these regulations weren't saints, they were soldiers following orders within a system designed to function independently of individual sentiment. That distinction made all the difference. Systems could be predictable even when individuals weren't. Regulations could protect prisoners even when guards harbored legitimate hatred for enemies who had killed their comrades. April 25, 1945. 1,437 hours. Torgau, River Elbe. American and Soviet forces met for the first time, effectively cutting Germany in half. For German units caught between advancing armies, this moment represented the closing of options. The gap that had allowed westward flight had narrowed to nothing. What followed would be the most desperate phase of the mass surrender. General Major Kurt Felber commanded army detachment positions south of Berlin. Approximately 35,000 men from fragmented units gathered into an ad hoc formation. Soviet forces pressed from the east. American forces held positions along the Elbe to the west. The corridor between them, once 120 kilometers wide, had contracted to less than 40 kilometers. Felber's staff calculated they had perhaps 72 hours before complete Soviet encirclement. The decision-making process documented in Felber's surviving orders revealed the brutal calculus facing German commanders. His forces could fight a delaying action against Soviet advance, buying time for other units but condemning themselves to Soviet captivity. Or they could attempt a mass breakout toward American lines, accepting heavy casualties during the movement but potentially saving the majority from Soviet prisoner camps. Felber chose breakout. His operations order, dated April 26, specified, all units will execute fighting withdrawal toward American sector beginning 0400 hours April 27, maintain unit cohesion. Heavy weapons will be abandoned when they impede movement. Wounded will be transported to the maximum extent possible. Primary mission is reaching American lines before Soviet encirclement becomes absolute. What followed was military chaos on an unprecedented scale. 35,000 German soldiers, some in organized formations, others in small groups, moved westward across terrain already devastated by years of warfare. Soviet forces, recognizing the mass movement, launched intensive artillery bombardments to prevent the escape. American forces, uncertain whether this represented continued German resistance or mass surrender attempt, maintained defensive positions and engaged German formations approaching their lines. The human cost was catastrophic. Wehrmacht records, fragmentary and incomplete, suggest approximately 8,000 German soldiers died during the 40-kilometer withdrawal, killed by Soviet artillery, American defensive fire, or simple exhaustion and accident during the desperate movement. But approximately 27,000 reached American positions between April 27 and April 30, surrendering in the largest single mass capitulation to American forces in the European theater. American commanders, overwhelmed by the scale of surrender, established emergency processing procedures. The 69th Infantry Division, which received the bulk of Felber's surrendering forces, documented the challenge of processing nearly 30,000 prisoners in 72 hours while maintaining defensive positions and conducting ongoing operations against other German units still resisting. The phenomenon demonstrated the complete collapse of German resistance in the West concurrent with continued desperate fighting in the East. German soldiers were simultaneously surrendering en masse to Americans while fighting fanatically to avoid Soviet capture. This dichotomy revealed the fundamental truth driving the mass westward movement: the choice of captor mattered more than the fact of capture. Lieutenant Thomas Bradford, commanding a company of the 273rd Infantry Regiment, documented his astonishment at German behavior during this period. We watched German formations fighting their way through their own rearguard positions to reach our lines. They were taking casualties from their own people to surrender to us. I've never seen anything like it. These weren't defeated soldiers, they were men making a calculated choice about survival. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. May 2, 1945. 1,115 hours. POW Processing Center, Halle an der Saale. Major Robert Kellerman, commanding officer of the 106th Military Police Battalion, supervised what had become the largest prisoner processing operation in American military history. In the previous 72 hours, his unit had received over 63,000 German prisoners, more than the entire Allied prisoner population in North Africa during 1943. The scale threatened to overwhelm every system, yet the institutional framework held. What prevented complete chaos was the American military's commitment to procedural standardization even under extreme pressure. The U.S. Army had anticipated mass surrenders. Planners had studied the collapse of German forces in Tunisia in 1943 and developed protocols for processing unprecedented numbers of prisoners. These procedures, refined over 2 years, now faced their ultimate test. The processing system operated in stages, each designed to handle specific aspects of prisoner management. Stage 1 occurred at forward collection points, typically within 2,000 yards of surrender locations. German soldiers were searched for weapons, given initial medical screening, and tagged with preliminary capture cards. This stage processed approximately 500 prisoners per hour using teams of 12 military police and 4 medical personnel. Stage 2 involved division-level cages where detailed documentation began. Prisoners provided complete identification information, were photographed and fingerprinted, and underwent comprehensive medical examination. Intelligence officers conducted initial interrogations, separating high-value targets, SS officers, Gestapo personnel, senior Wehrmacht commanders, for transfer to specialized interrogation facilities. This stage could process approximately 200 prisoners per hour per facility. Stage 3, handled by theater provost marshal units, involved assignment to semi-permanent enclosures and notification to the International Red Cross. This final processing generated the documentation that would follow each prisoner through the entire POW system and eventually facilitate repatriation. The Americans maintained records with obsessive precision: name, rank, serial number, unit, capture date and location, medical conditions, and eventual enclosure assignment. The institutional commitment extended to resource allocation that astounded German prisoners. Oberstleutnant Werner Vogel, captured on April 28 with elements of the 11th Panzer Division, documented his experience in post-war testimony. Within 36 hours of surrender, I had been medically examined, fed 3 times, issued a blanket and basic toiletries, and assigned to a barracks with other officers. An American lieutenant informed me through a translator that the International Red Cross had been notified of my capture and my wife would be informed within 3 weeks. This seemed impossible given the chaos of Germany's collapse, yet it happened exactly as promised. The system's resilience derived from its independence from individual decision-making. American guards couldn't arbitrarily alter rations, couldn't selectively deny medical treatment, couldn't override established procedures based on personal feelings about prisoners. Courts-martial records from the European theater document several cases where American personnel faced prosecution for mistreating German prisoners. The system enforced its own rules even against members enforcing it. This institutional protection created an environment where survival became calculable. German prisoners could predict with reasonable accuracy what would happen to them based on established patterns. They would receive adequate food, not generous, but sufficient. They would receive medical treatment for serious conditions. They would be allowed to correspond with families through Red Cross channels. They would not face summary execution, systematic torture, or deliberate starvation. Contrast this with intelligence flowing from German prisoners who had experienced Soviet captivity before transfer or escape. Their accounts, shared throughout the POW network, described an environment where survival depended entirely on individual captor decisions, where procedural protections didn't exist, where prisoners disappeared without documentation or explanation. The American system wasn't perfect. Overcrowding in May 1945 created sanitation challenges, food quality varied, and some guards were brutal despite regulations. But the system's fundamental architecture remained intact, institutional procedures that operated independently of individual hatred, creating an environment where German soldiers could survive with reasonable certainty. This certainty, this calculable predictability, explained why 500,000 German soldiers fought their way westward to surrender specifically to American forces rather than accept the alternative fate awaiting them in Soviet hands. May 5, 1945. 0820 hours. Forward positions, Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. General Major Rudolf Toussaint commanded the remnants of the 1st Panzer Division, approximately 11,000 men who had maintained unit cohesion through the chaotic retreat from eastern Germany. Soviet forces approached from multiple directions. American Third Army units under General George Patton had halted their advance 30 kilometers to the west, following agreements with Soviet command. Toussaint faced a decision that epitomized the psychological calculus driving German surrender preferences. The information available to Toussaint, compiled from intelligence reports and prisoner testimony networks, presented 2 distinct futures. Surrender to approaching Soviet forces meant immediate uncertainty, no established protocol, no predictable treatment, substantial probability of summary execution for officers of his rank, and for survivors, transferred to labor camps in the Soviet interior with mortality rates exceeding 50% in the first year. Surrender to American forces offered calculable outcomes based on 2 years of documented treatment patterns. Initial processing within 24 to 48 hours, medical treatment for wounded, adequate rations meeting Geneva Convention standards, officer privileges maintained, eventual repatriation after hostilities concluded. The contrast wasn't subtle, it was existential. But reaching American lines required crossing 30 kilometers of contested territory while maintaining enough combat strength to fight through obstacles, all while signaling surrender intentions to avoid being destroyed by American forces uncertain of German objectives. Toussaint's staff calculated casualties during the movement could reach 20%, approximately 2,200 men. The mathematics were brutal but clear, losing 2,200 men to reach American captivity versus losing potentially 5,500 or more to Soviet captivity's documented mortality rates. The psychological dimensions extended beyond individual survival calculations. German military culture, shaped by Prussian traditions emphasizing honor and duty, had constructed elaborate frameworks around acceptable surrender conditions. These frameworks had crumbled in the East, where surrender to Soviets meant probable death, but survived in the West, where American treatment allowed soldiers to surrender with dignity intact. Lieutenant Franz Becker, a company commander in Toussaint's division, documented the psychological transformation in his personal diary, recovered after the war. We are not surrendering because we are cowards. We are surrendering because the war is lost and the Americans offer us a chance to survive and return to rebuild Germany. The Soviets offer only revenge and death. This is not about fear, it is about rational calculation of which choice serves Germany's future. This rationalization mattered immensely to German soldiers conditioned by years of ideological indoctrination about fighting to the death. American treatment protocols provided psychological permission to surrender by creating conditions that preserved military honor. German soldiers could tell themselves they were surrendering to a professional military force that respected Geneva Conventions, not submitting to an enemy seeking vengeance and annihilation. The American institutional approach, ironically, made surrender psychologically acceptable to an enemy army indoctrinated against capitulation. By treating prisoners according to established rules rather than emotions, by maintaining military courtesies even toward defeated enemies, the Americans created an environment where German soldiers could surrender without feeling they had betrayed fundamental military values. Soviet treatment, driven by legitimate rage over German atrocities in the Soviet Union and unbounded by Geneva Convention restrictions, made surrender psychologically unacceptable even when militarily necessary. German soldiers facing Soviets often fought to death not from ideological fanaticism but from rational calculation that death in combat was preferable to death in captivity. Toussaint issued his order at 0900 hours on May 5, division will execute fighting withdrawal toward American sector. All units maintain cohesion and discipline. We surrender as soldiers of Germany to a professional enemy who will treat us as soldiers, not as criminals to be exterminated. This distinction is worth the risks of the movement. Over the next 48 hours, approximately 9,200 of Toussaint's men successfully reached American Third Army positions. They surrendered with flags improvised from white sheets, maintaining military formation, officers saluting American commanders before formally capitulating. The psychology of calculated surrender had preserved both their lives and their sense of military honor, an outcome impossible under Soviet treatment protocols. May 8, 1945. 2,301 hours. The war in Europe ended officially, but the movement of German soldiers toward American rather than Soviet captivity continued for days afterward. In the chaos of Germany's final collapse, the statistical accounting of this mass westward flight remained incomplete, but the scale was undeniable. Theater Provost Marshal records documented over 500,000 German prisoners entering American custody in the final 3 weeks of the war, far exceeding the number surrendering to Soviet forces despite the Red Army's numerical superiority and deeper penetration into German territory. The phenomenon represented more than tactical surrender, it revealed fundamental truths about military capitulation and modern industrial warfare. German soldiers had made calculated decisions based on institutional reputation rather than individual circumstances. They surrendered not to specific American units or commanders, but to an American system that treated prisoners according to predictable procedures rather than emotional responses. Lieutenant Colonel David Morrison, chief of the Prisoner of War Division, European Theater, compiled the final statistical summary in July 1945. The numbers told an extraordinary story. American forces, operating primarily in Western Germany, received approximately 3.8 million German prisoners between D-Day and VE Day. Soviet forces, operating across a much larger front with far more troops, received approximately 2.4 million German prisoners during the same period. The disparity reflected German preferences, not battlefield geography. The human stories behind these statistics revealed the individual calculations that created the mass phenomenon. Gefreiter Paul Richter, a 19-year-old infantryman from Hamburg, surrendered to American forces on May 4 after walking 140 kilometers westward from his unit's positions facing Soviet forces. His testimony, recorded during routine prisoner processing, was typical of thousands. I had heard from other soldiers that Americans treat prisoners according to rules. They give food, medical care, and eventually send you home. The Soviets, everyone knew what happened to prisoners in Soviet camps. The choice was obvious. The institutional architecture that enabled American POW treatment had required massive resource commitments that reflected American industrial capacity. By May 1945, the U.S. Army operated 187 prisoner enclosures in the European theater, housing over 3 million prisoners. The logistical infrastructure supporting these facilities, food supplies, medical equipment, administrative personnel, construction materials, represented a commitment that only American industrial capacity could sustain. The contrast with Soviet prisoner operations reflected different strategic priorities and capabilities. Soviet forces, operating at the end of extended supply lines and having suffered catastrophic losses during the German invasion, lacked resources for elaborate prisoner care systems. More fundamentally, Soviet leadership prioritized retribution over Geneva Convention compliance. The result was prisoner treatment that German soldiers rationally chose to avoid at almost any cost. The long-term consequences of this mass surrender preference shaped post-war Europe. The 500,000 German soldiers who fought their way westward to surrender specifically to Americans represented a demographic preservation, men who survived to return to Germany, rebuild families, and contribute to reconstruction. Their Soviet-captured counterparts faced dramatically different fates. Approximately 60% never returned from Soviet captivity, dying in labor camps or from the harsh conditions of forced labor in the Soviet interior. The American institutional commitment to prisoner treatment, driven by procedural compliance rather than humanitarian sentiment, had created an unexpected strategic advantage. By treating prisoners according to established rules, American forces had incentivized surrender, shortened resistance, and saved both American and German lives. The system worked not because Americans were morally superior, but because institutional procedures constrained individual actions and created predictable outcomes. General Dwight Eisenhower, in his final report on European operations, noted the phenomenon. The mass surrender of German forces to American rather than Soviet troops in the final weeks of the war demonstrated that enemy soldiers, when given a choice, will choose captivity that offers survival with dignity over captivity that offers probable death. This calculation shortened the war and saved countless lives on both sides. The untold story of why 500,000 German soldiers chose American captivity over Soviet capture wasn't about American kindness or German cowardice. It was about the power of institutional systems to shape behavior, the rationality of soldiers facing impossible choices, and the fundamental human drive to survive when survival becomes possible. The streams of German soldiers moving westward in the war's final days weren't fleeing combat, they were choosing calculable futures over uncertain death, institutional procedure over individual vengeance, and survival over honor without survival's possibility. Today, the archives hold the documented evidence, surrender cards, processing records, prisoner testimonies, and unit histories that together reveal one of World War II's most significant yet overlooked phenomena, the Great Westward Flight, that demonstrated how institutional systems could overcome individual hatred, how procedural compliance could save lives, and how the choice of captor could mean the difference between death and survival for 500,000 men who made the rational calculation to surrender west rather than east. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.